So step 4 in an outbreak investigation is performing a risk factor study. So we're going to talk about this in 2 different parts. And in part 1, we'll talk about a risk factor study in a defined population. So the basic idea of a risk factor study is we want to identify exposures that are associated with disease, because these exposures may indicate the source of disease or activities that aid in its transmission. So a simple measure of association in a risk factor study is relative risk, or RR, as it's sometimes denoted. And the relative risk is the attack rate in the people who've had some exposure versus the attack rate in people who did not have exposure. If this relative risk is much greater than 1, then the exposure is highly associated with the disease. So to calculate an attack rate, we divide the number of people in a group who developed a disease by the total number of people in that group. And groups can be defined by individual characteristics. So we might define the attack rate by the number of people of a particular age who developed a disease, divided by all of the people who are that age. When we're doing risk factor studies, we're often doing this based on exposure. So we might compare the number of people who got sick after drinking milk at lunch versus the total number of people who drank milk at lunch. Likewise, we might characterize the group at risk by location or other factors. Here's an example from the monkeypox outbreak in prairie dogs that we've been going back to throughout this module. So if we look on the right, we have a table of prairie dog exposure and clinical monkeypox around childcare attendees. So this table shows whether or not people were exposed to prairie dogs, and among people who were and weren't exposed, the number who got sick, the number who weren't sick, and the total number. So now we want to calculate some attack rates. So the attack rate in exposed children are the number of children who were exposed to prairie dogs who got sick, 2, divided by the total number of children exposed to prairie dogs, 6. So the attack rate is around 33%. The attack rate in unexposed children is the number of children who got sick who were not exposed to prairie dogs, 2, divided by the total number of children who were not exposed to prairie dogs, 12. So that's 16.7%. So we divide these attack rates to calculate their relative risk. So 33% divided by 16% is roughly 2. So children who are exposed to prairie dogs had a relative risk of 2 of developing monkeypox, or that is, they were twice as likely to develop monkeypox compared to those children who are not exposed to prairie dogs. Here's another example of an outbreak in a defined population, this time drinking raw milk. So here we have a table of raw milk consumption and campylobacteriosis in participants in a 3rd grade field trip to a farm. So here you notice among those who had no milk, nobody got sick. So the attack rate was 0%. Whereas among children who had 1 or 2 glasses of milk, the attack rate was 35% and 60% respectively. So in this case, the relative risk is infinite. 60% divided by 0% is infinity, which provides pretty strong evidence that maybe drinking milk has something to do with getting sick. We have another piece of evidence here that's often useful to look at, and that's a dose-response relationship. So what that is here we see an increasing attack rate with increasing consumption of milk. So people who had 0 glasses of milk had no cases. People who had 1 glass of milk, 35% of those people were cases. And people who had 2 more glasses of milk, 60% of those people who had cases. So this increasing dose-response relationship gives us further evidence that milk was the cause of the outbreak. So to go over some key points from this section. The attack rate is the percentage of a group that gets the disease. The relative risk provides a comparison of attack rates between 2 groups. A relative risk above 1 indicates that the group in the numerator has a higher attack rate than the group in the denominator. Importantly, this approach only works if the exposed and unexposed populations are identified without regard to their disease status. That is, we can't be including people in our study based on whether or not they're cases. We'll talk about what to do when this isn't true in the next section. This condition is most often fulfilled when there's a clearly defined population at risk, for instance, students in a school.